Okay, so welcome everyone to the third seminar in this Disaffection seminar series hosted by the Enlightenment, Romanticism and Contemporary Culture Research Unit at the University of Melbourne. So I'm Ben Gook, a lecturer in Cultural Studies at Melbourne and organiser of this particular series. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we meet today to discuss, among other things, matters of colonialism and its afterlives. I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present, acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that the struggle for justice continues. So we have two speakers today introducing two recently published books. So first, Camille Robcis is Professor of French and History at Columbia University. She specialises in modern European history with an emphasis on gender and sexuality, France, and intellectual, cultural, and legal history. And second, we have Tanya Agathocleous, is Professor of English at Hunter College and the Graduate Centre at CUNY. Her research interests include 19th and 20th century British literature and culture, empire studies and colonial print culture with a speciality in India, post-colonial studies and the history of transnational ideas and politics. We also have a discussant today who is John Cash, who's a social theorist with a particular interest in the incorporation of psychoanalytic theory into social and political analysis. He's an honorary fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne, where formerly he was Deputy Director of the program in social theory. He's also been a founding editor of the journal Critical Horizons, a long-serving editor of post-colonial studies, and until recently an editor of political psychology. So I just wanted to say a few words before we let our guests discuss their books together, which I'm really looking forward to. As I was organising the series, I thought I'd made a sort of genius connection between these two recently published books, with their emphasis on the negation of certain emotions and experiences. They seemed like a productive pair of books to put into dialogue. It turns out, however, that Tanya and Camille already knew each other. And while that was a sort of blow to my ego and narcissism, it also makes a lot of sense. So more importantly, what I think is interesting about looking at these books side by side is that they allow us to think about this prefix in particular, this dis, and its relation to the feeling, emotion, or experience that is being negated. So I think on one side, we have this largely desirable overcoming of alienation, and on the other, a more ambiguous negation of affection. So in both cases, they ask us to consider what we're being disaffected from or by, as well as what the sites or objects of affection were. And with disalienation, what it was that alienated us in the first place and what the state of disalienation might finally look like. So I look forward to hearing more about this. So Tanya and Camille will talk for 30 to 40 minutes with introductions of their books and then a conversation between them, and then John Cash will respond for sort of 5 to 10 minutes after that, and we can have questions and Q&A. Feel free to use the chat function to post responses as we go, and we can come back to those points in the Q&A if you like. We're scheduled to run for about an hour, and we'll try and stick to that, but may go over a little bit if we need to, if there's a lot of discussion, but that's the program. So I've stopped sharing and I can see that Camille is here now, which is good.
Sorry about that. My computer crashed.
It's all good. We had intros to do, so it's fine. We discussed whether you and Tanya had figured out who would go first, and you hadn't, but we decided that Tanya would because she turned up first. So
that's great.
I'll hand it over to Tanya.
Okay.
Am I able to screen share?
I think so. Can you see the button?
Yes. Okay, I'll do that in a minute.
Let me just Sorry, Ben. I'll just I'll make that function open for you now, Tanya. 1 second.
Oh, okay.
Actually, sorry, Ben, for some reason I don't have that ability on my end. Do you, if you hover over the participants for Tanya, are you able to open that for her?
I can make a co-host.
Yeah, okay, that should work.
Great.
So I'm going to just briefly summarize some of the overarching themes of my book for those unfamiliar with it. But first, I wanted to thank Ben for inviting me to share my work at the seminar and to be in conversation with Camille, which is a real treat. As Ben mentioned, I've known Camille for many, many years now. He didn't know this when he invited us, but we are good friends and we've been in conversation throughout the writing of our books about our work process and our overarching goals, but we haven't really talked in detail about the contents of our books since finishing them, so being able to think about her work really in relation to mine in this sort of formal way is a pleasure. And also thanks to everyone for being here. So the context for my research is one particular colonial law, section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, which made disaffection, defined as hatred of the government, the equivalent of sedition. So by using affect as evidence of sedition instead of, say, seditious statements, like, you know, let's burn down the Houses of Parliament, section 124A broadened and made more diffuse the application of British sedition law, which was much more restricted in its purview. So now I'm going to try the screen share and just to show you that law. Hold on. Let's see. Okay, so here it is. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. And so I'll just give you a second to read over that. So the effects of the law is that the press was essentially censored. It was monitored closely by the government that had an elaborate system for keeping track of it. It's called the Native Newspaper Report, where essentially there's a shadow press like taking notes on almost every article that came out in the Indian press. So it's just reams and reams and reams of documents that are now evidence of this censorship. After 1890, when the first trial of a newspaper for disaffection took place, any publication or speech could be criminalized using this law. This meant that editors or writers who didn't want to risk getting charged had to be extremely circumspect about what they wrote and how it was expressed. This provides a different angle, I think, for theories of colonial imitation, such as Homi Bhabha's colonial mimicry, because it suggests that mimicry was a deliberate form of camouflage. The use of British periodical forms, such as that of the periodical Hindu Punch, for example, or the Indian World, which are very closely referring to pre-existing British periodical forms, were strategies adopted to mass critique. So if Indian journals look like British ones, they seem to be exemplifying dutiful engagement with British culture, but also provided opportunities for writers to speak directly to the kinds of periodicals they were imitating, and thus have a voice in what I call the imperial Anglosphere. So the idea of the imperial Anglosphere is also crucial to my work. As I researched English language periodicals in India, I came to see that they were implicitly in conversation with the Anglo-Indian press, so the press produced by British people living in India under Empire. And they were often also explicitly in conversation with the British press in Britain. So there's a triangulated conversation going on in which Indians are attempting to refute the racist and dismissive ways they're characterized in the Anglo-Indian press, and also to appeal to the British public and potentially an even wider international audience by making this conversation explicit through this adoption of familiar periodical forms. So I'm going to give a brief illustrative example from my book. In 1907, editorial column in a proto-nationalist newspaper called The Indian World argued that most English reporting on India relied on misleading or false reports produced by correspondents who visited India without acquiring any, quote, reliable and accurate first-hand knowledge. So a case in point was British anxieties about Indian unrest in the wake of the 1905 partition of Bengal, an act which provoked both widespread protests and a wave of bombings. The editorial contended that the British press was sensationalizing and exaggerating the gravity of this moment, fallaciously making, quote, the English people believe that the sedition cobra has raised its hood in India against the English. Two cartoons accompanying this article depict the Indian unrest as viewed by the English press and the Indian unrest as viewed by the Indian people. So here's this original cartoon that appeared in Punch, where, see, it's called The Indian Secretary Bird. Mr. Morley puts his foot on sedition in India. So that appears in Punch in June 5th, 1907. And then this is what appears in the Indian World. So it's a hand-copied drawing of the Punch cartoon called The Indian Unrest as Viewed by the English Press. So it's a citation of the Punch cartoon, essentially. More or less reproducing it. And then there's the second cartoon that appears called The Indian Unrest as Viewed by the Indian People. And this is the sort of parodic version of it that's called The Indian Secretary Bird Duped. Mr. Morley throttles peace, progress, and liberty in India, with apologies to Mr. Punch. So it's drawn in the same style, obviously, and serves as a rebuttal to the original Punch cartoon. Here in the satirical version, the secretary bird is not fiercely heroic, but instead has been duped into turning against liberal values, an about-face of which Morley was frequently accused when he supported the suppression of disaffection in India after having championed freedom of the press in Britain as a member of parliament. The subtitle of the caption there summarizes the image's attempt to allegorize the hypocrisies of liberal imperialism. Its abandoned ideals are represented by two small birds, Peace and Progress, and a doll named Liberty, who the secretary bird is strangling with its claws. The bird's vacant stare, meanwhile, suggests he is unaware that the snake he is killing is a toy being manipulated from a distance by a monkey. Sitting on a whole box of provoking toy snakes, the monkey turns his head to look out knowingly at the viewer. He's an obvious stand-in for the so-called Babu, a stereotype of the mimic man or English-educated Indian writer that permeated the Anglo-Indian press and often used primate imagery. And I talk about this at length in my chapter on parody, chapter 2. I'll sort of talk about the whole structure very briefly in a second. So part of my argument is that the imperial public sphere was racialized by Section 124A, which, because it focused on criminalizing Indian writing, imagined it as emotional and volatile, which of course fit with pre-existing ideas about Indians as childlike and irrational. So the reimagining of the public sphere in this moment as a place where affect was always hiding under the surface, ready to erupt at any moment, I think changes our understanding of it as a place governed by norms of communicative rationality and provides a long historical view of debates about incivility still with us today. By exploring how affect was explicitly connected to politics in the colonial period through censorship law, I hope to offer a new context for both emphases, showing that affect was simultaneously produced as an effect of governmentality and as the site of resistance to it. So each chapter of the book explores different tactics of critique used by journalists or editors in India that emerged in the context of this censorship and in relation to the British press. And I organize the chapters under the 4 key terms that express how these tactics work formally. So affectation, parody, review, and syncretism. So here's a little summary of the table of contents. Over the course of these chapters, I look at a range of different sources. So there are different periodicals that are in conversation with each other, such as the different versions of Punch, that proliferated in India, and such as W.T. Stead's reviews and the Indian world from which those cartoons that I just showed you came. They also look at newspaper trials in chapter 1, conferences, and literary works as well. The conclusion of the book focuses on the stakes of the study for contemporary political debates. The colonial history of disaffection, I argue, helps us to understand why that term continues to be used to describe those who feel marginalized by politics and political debates today. While used in different but related ways to its colonial antecedents, the concept of disaffection is still valuable as a way of understanding the relationship between the content of politics and the form of publics. In the contemporary US, with its growing political divides, various potential voters from the alt-right to left liberals are described by the media as disaffected, depending on which party is in power. By exploring the dynamics of the imperial public sphere, my work hopes to shed light on why publics continue to be shaped by feelings of exclusion and why exclusion is understood as a feeling. The law against disaffection made explicit the ways the public sphere was divided into those who could and could not exercise free speech along racial lines, and this helps to explain why censorship and free speech debates today so often coalesce around questions of identity. That's it.
Should I go?
Yeah, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was great, Tanya. Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everyone in Australia. Thanks for having us, and I'm really happy also to be in dialogue with Tanya and to tell you a little bit about this book that I just finished last spring. I'm also going to share my screen, so let me see if this works. Oh, it's saying, hang on 1 second, it's telling me I need to. Oh, will not be able to record. Okay, let's see if it works now. Okay, it should work. Can you see it? Good, okay. So let me put it in big screen. Okay, so so the book is called Disalienation. It's an attempt to map the conversation between politics, philosophy, and radical psychiatry in post-war France. And in particular, it's an attempt to trace the history of this movement that's called institutional psychotherapy. So I thought in around the 10 minutes that I have, I would tell you a little bit about this movement and explain some of the stakes of the book. So first of all, where was it born? The context of its birth is really important to understand institutional psychotherapy. It was born in this small town in central France called Saint-Alban. It's a small village, basically, in the middle of France. And the context of the war, it was born during the Second World War. The context of the war was really important because it brought together the cast of characters that ended up kind of doing institutional psychotherapy. It was first of all a praxis, but also laying out its theoretical foundations. But the war and the experience of fascism was also central in convincing the practitioners of institutional psychotherapy that psychiatry was and needed to be fundamentally political. So you may have heard about, I mean, I think we've all heard about the Third Reich's open embrace of eugenics and the forced euthanasia of those that the regime judged the incurably sick, including the cognitively disabled, which resulted in around 300,000 deaths in Germany. But what's less well known is what was happening in French hospitals during the war during these years. And the Vichy regime, so France was occupied by Germany at this time, or half of it. What it did was essentially let patients die of cold, of hunger, or lack of care within the walls of the hospital. Some historians have referred to this as a soft extermination. These are some of the books that have come out on this, of around 40,000 patients died in French psychiatric hospitals. So this context is really, really important to understand that what the first sort of impetus of institutional psychotherapy was. For the doctors, the nurses, and the staff that worked at Saint-Alban, who were all painfully aware of this reality, the immediate goal was literally to survive the war and to hoard enough food to feed the patients and allow them to basically not die. But along the way, these doctors were joined by poets, visual artists, philosophers, and political activists who all shared this interest in madness and also this vision of psychiatry as a deeply political practice. So who was at Saint-Alban? Probably the most important name, but is one that we haven't, that is less well known in the genealogy of the thinkers that I'll talk about, but who was extremely important, is François Tosquelles, who was a Catalan-born psychiatrist, and who, as he was studying psychiatry in Barcelona in the 1930s, 1920s, was also one of the founding members of the PUM. You see a picture of the PUM down here that I put. Some of you might have heard about the PUM from George Orwell's How Much to Catalonia, but it's basically, it's kind of one of the many groups that emerged during those years, very committed to a kind of self-management, radical critique, critical of Stalinism. And so this kind of spirit of grassroots politics is something that marked Tosquelles and that really he took with him in his experiments in psychiatry. The other thing I'll say about Tosquelles, because it's important for the theory that he eventually puts forth, is that he was one of the early readers of Lacan. And in particular, one of the early readers of the thesis, Lacan's 1932 thesis on paranoia, which where Lacan is, less the psychoanalyst that we have come to know, and more the Lacan the doctor, right? And this thesis in particular was almost like a sort of manifesto for the psychiatric profession at the time. Psychiatry, which was very much still committed to an organicist, neuroscientific approach to the brain, right, trying to find the cause of mental illness on the brain. For Lacan, one of the things he argued in this thesis was that, in fact, psychiatry needed to be anchored in a Freudian understanding of the subject. That is, a subject that is constructed in relation to conscious and unconscious representation of others. So what this meant is that the social was absolutely central in any psychic processes, that the psyche was not something you could isolate, it was always constructed in a social environment. After Tosquelles, so Tosquelles fights in the Spanish Civil War and ends up losing, like everybody does, against the Franco troops, and he eventually ends up in a French concentration camp. You see him here in a picture in the concentration camp in the south. This is one of the places where he really comes to understand what he calls concentrationism, and this is something that marks him again deeply, because when he arrives at the psychiatric hospital, he says that the psychiatric hospital really looks like a camp, right? It feels the same way. They have the same kinds of structures, totalitarian institutions. So in the camp, he basically he decides that he's going to try to set up a psychiatric service to help temper the effects of so-called camp psychosis. And so he organizes concerts, performances, etc., to try to help the prisoners, but also the army. Everybody basically could use psychiatric treatment. He learns two important lessons from this. First of all, that psychiatry can be practiced anywhere. So this is his quote, right, that he practiced psychiatry in the mud and that was okay. And secondly, that when you treated a patient, you also needed to treat his or her social environment, that you needed to cure the camp, the hospital, the institution at the same time as you cured the patient. And so this is really the kinds of lessons that he took with him to Saint-Alban when he arrived right in the middle of the Second World War. And so the best definition I can give you of institutional psychotherapy, it's hard to give you a precise definition because it's not a model, it's not a template, it's more a sort of ethics, a kind of practice of everyday life. But it's this definition by Jean Oury. So here you have Tosquelles with Oury and Bonafé, so three important, all of whom were at Saint-Alban. Oury writes, institutional psychotherapy was the act of setting up all kinds of mechanisms to fight every day against that which can turn the whole collective towards a concentrationist or segregationist structure. So what does this mean? I think what he means by this is that we all need institutions, right? We all need, socially and psychically, we need hospitals, we need families, we need schools, we need offices. But so the problem is not institutions as such. The problem is that they all have it's not even the problem. The problem is not even that they generate conflict, because of course they do. The problem is that they all have this potential to become concentrationist, authoritarian, hierarchical, stagnant, oppressive. And this had become especially clear to Tosquelles after the POUM, right? When he saw what had happened to Stalinism. Marxism wasn't supposed to be this way, and yet it was. So how could we prevent this? How could we disalienate the hospital? And so this is really the kind of, how can we disalienate the hospital? And more generally, how could we disalienate institutions? And here we have to understand alienation in its French double meaning as alienation, meaning mental. It's a kind of mental condition, a psychic state of being mad or insane, but also a social condition where you feel estranged, trapped, or isolated from others. So I think one way to put this, in other words, how we could put this is the kind of challenge of institutional psychotherapy was to imagine a psychiatric practice within the confines of the hospital. So a psychiatric practice, a philosophy, a social theory that could prevent the chronic reappearance of these political and psychic concentrationisms. So institutions that could be constantly rethought, reworked, or remapped. So this is kind of abstract, but I wanted to show you some kind of examples, some practical examples of what they did. So this is the hospital. The first thing they did was to tumble the walls that surround the hospital, because again, the idea was to integrate the hospital in the village. So you see them kind of with hammers bringing down the walls. Similarly, they took away the cells in the hospital. So you see this is where they slept, right? Everybody's living together, everybody eats together, to really try to get rid of this idea that you're trapped in a particular position, that you're in a fixed identity. These are some examples of the posters that I found in the archives of Saint-Alban. So theater productions, jazz concerts, right? All of this was organized for the patients to reconstruct a social life, a social fabric. Ergotherapy stations, so where the patients could do art. And some of the art that was produced in the hospital made actually its way to museums. This is one example of an artist who was in the hospital, and you see Tosquelles here carrying his boat. Forestier, whose work is now at the Museum of Art Brut in Lausanne, in Switzerland. The person who was responsible for moving some of this work was Georges Canguilhem, Jean Dubuffet. Georges Canguilhem is also there, but Jean Dubuffet, who visited Saint-Alban, met with Forestier, and was really interested in the kind of possibility of the kind of more authentic approach to art that madness could have. So there's all these kinds of interesting connections to surrealism, to Art Brut. So what was the legacy of this? Some of the other people that I write about in my book are Fanon, who was a resident a medical resident at Saint-Alban after he completed medical school in Lyon. And by the time he arrived at Saint-Alban, Fanon had already written Black Skin, White Masks. So in some ways, he was very impressed. He was also very disappointed with traditional psychiatry, with the kind of biologism and essentialism of psychiatry. And the kinds of results that Tosquelles and his colleagues were getting at Saint-Alban confirmed many of the hypotheses that Fanon had put forth in his early works, especially around race and racism. And so Fanon practiced institutional psychotherapy in North Africa. You see him here in a picture with his team in Blida. But what I'm really interested in is also the way in which that institutional psychotherapy sort of permeated his more famous political works, including Wretched of the Earth, which is not explicitly psychoanalytic except in the last chapter, but Fanon was seeing patients, basically was writing Wretched of the Earth in the morning, dictating it to his secretary from 7 to 9 a.m., and then seeing patients all day. So you really, I think, have to see these texts in conversation. And I put a picture here of psychiatric writings, which are fantastic and now available all in English in one collection edited by Robert Young and Jean Calfa. Another person that you might have heard of is Jean Oury, who was an intern at Saint-Alban and then founded the Clinic of Laborde, which became a kind of mythical pilgrimage site for the French intellectual world. It welcomed philosophers, artists, writers, filmmakers. And the person that was perhaps most famous, who spent his life at Laborde, was Felix Guattari, the philosopher and psychoanalyst and political activist. So in the book, I read his 1972 book that he co-wrote with Gilles Deleuze, Anti-Oedipus, as a kind of attempt to put philosophy, a kind of philosophical translation, if you'd like, of institutional psychotherapy, an attempt to again, a kind of book to figure out disalienation. The term they use is Oedipalization, but it's a similar process, right? It's the question is, why is it that how can they convince us to give up our attachment to authority and to oppression in our practices of everyday life, and to renounce what they call the fascisms in our head? So this is, so the book is basically organized around, I won't talk about this, but it's basically organized around case studies of individual figures, from François Tosquelles to Fanon to Guattari, and to Foucault. And the end is really an attempt to think about how can we use institutional psychotherapy politically, or what does it mean? What can we take? What kind of lessons can we bring? Because ultimately, institutional psychotherapy was interested in group formations and political formations also. So how can we use some of the concepts and the experiments, the practical experiments that it puts forth, to open up new political imaginaries? So I'll stop here. And I'll stop sharing. Did it stop sharing? No. Oh, stop share. There.
Not yet.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks so much to both of you for outlining your books. I think Tanya said you've got a few questions you quickly wanted to pose to each other. So who wants to go first?
I can go first because I have a good follow-up for Camille's, the way Camille ended her, her talk just then. We had a few questions, but maybe, Camille, we should restrict them to, like, say, a couple each, so that so that John has a chance to talk and other people.
Or if John wants to come in now, I'm also happy to let John in and then to the questions, whatever you think would be best.
We could do that. What do you think, Ben?
Sure. John, do you feel like jumping in now?
Look, I'm happy.
That way it can be more of a dialogue.
Sure, I'm happy to. And fortunately, what I've got to say will relate to what we've heard, I think, I hope. So one of the texts that Tanya discusses in her book is Ashish Nandy's The Intimate Enemy. And because it's probably well known or somewhat known to most of the people, or many of the people who are attending this event today, I wanted to, and because it's of relevance to the discussion, I wanted to begin with a very brief summary as a way of setting up and, as it were, giving some structure to my own comments or response. So I'll do that very quickly and then move into further discussion. So in addressing the British colonisation of India and its consolidation over time, Ashish Nandy emphasises the significance of both what he terms cultural alterations and psychic internalisations and identifications that together instituted the intimate enemy relation between coloniser and colonised that enabled colonisation to persist. Now, alterations is the crucial term here, because the newly instituted proper ways of performing an identity and relating to power, authority, and violence relied not on total replacement, but rather on the reconfiguration of the cultural field in both India and in Britain as well, so that the relative weighting of already present cultural forms, or subcultures as Nandy terms them, within both Indian and British culture were disturbed and revalued. These alterations brought to the fore British hypermasculinity in an intimate enemy relation with a devalued Indian feminized masculinity. Now, in turn, these transformed cultural codes were internalized. Hence, the colonial relation is understood as having been overdetermined from both without and within, which of course accords with both the talks and books we're considering. But of course, while marginalized, other subcultures remained and could support the persistence of what Nandy in the Savage Freud terms secret selves. So rather than a thoroughgoing transformation that leaves no trace or remainder, those now marginalized subcultures remained as a cultural resource for what he termed secret selves that survived beyond the gaze of the colonizing state and that involved living in what Nandi terms two worlds at once. Now, as I see it, Tanya's new book explores in exquisite detail how these disaffected secret selves found voice, particularly through parody. As we've heard, a public sphere is established through the publication of periodicals, journals, and magazines in which parody can circulate while claiming an affective loyalty that its very parodic form and content undermine. So, borrowing a term that Habermas borrows from Freud, we might regard this as a distorted public sphere in which parody voices and hence reveals the intimate enemy formation as a symptom that's being worked through. So parody as institutional psychotherapy, perhaps, that destabilizes the established colonial institution. Now, as Tanya told us, through the cross-seeding of Indian and British and other periodicals and publications, and subsequently their integration in digest form, so in Stead's review of reviews, for instance, Tanya highlights how an international public sphere emerges out of the colonial relation, while still being subject to multiple distortions. So I think what we see here is a making and remaking of institutions, from the empire to the nation state to the international. And that takes me to institutional psychotherapy and its similar focus on alienation from both without and within, and its focus on the role of the institution and the prospect of disalienation. Camille's new book is an exemplar of thorough and fascinating research that throws a new light on so many aspects of our knowledge of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and its resonance in French theory. For instance, to just give one example, which she mentioned, it fills in a crucial stage in Fanon's movement from Lyon to the psychiatric hospital in Rue de Jeanville by detailing both his intervening time at Saint-Alban and his implementation of what he discovered there at Blida. And just one fascinating instance from that account is Fanon's almost immediate therapeutic success with European women using the techniques that he had discovered at Saint-Alban, yet his failure with Muslim men until culturally appropriate alterations to the therapeutic method and practices were implemented. And as the story is told, this was only achieved after considerable research and reflection, field work in a way we could say. So for me, the treatment of the institution, and by implication any institution, as a source of alienation, but also as a potential resource for disalienation, is the most interesting recurring theme across both of these talks and books. As is Camille's concern to read institutional psychotherapy as a political theory. So as she put it, to an attempt to envision a different political imaginary that can still be useful today. And obviously Tanya was referencing the same intention, kind of intention. So I think this raises the question of how institutions can support an ongoing qualitative transformation of institutional norms and practices, and an ongoing destabilization of sovereign or would-be sovereign authorities. And finally, I do have a question about sublimation and how sublimation figures in both the parodic texts that Tanya has discussed and in the various activities were part and parcel of institutional psychotherapy aimed at curing the institution before curing the individual. So, very briefly, in India, is the turn to non-violence as the more effective form of resistance a form of sublimation that is also present in parodic texts and illustrations? And for Camille, of course, sublimation is rejected by Deleuze and Guattari, but as I read the explanations provided by Tosquelles, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, and others regarding the value of their therapeutic interventions and innovations, which you gave us a good listing of in your talk and in those illustrations. Practices like printing, reading, acting in theatrical performances, making various things, knitting, artistic production of many kinds, as well as just the broader communal activities. That seems to me like the creation of opportunities for sublimation. So I wonder if you see sublimation there, or sublimatory transference perhaps, if we could call it that, or does transversality make that a redundant question, not only for Guattari, which I presume it would, but also for institutional psychotherapy more broadly. It's been a great pleasure reading both these books and listening to your talk this morning here, this evening where you both are. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, John. Tanya, you were asked first about sublimation, so maybe we'll go to you.
Sure. Thank you, John. That was just amazing. I love your use of Nandi to draw all this out and make these connections. That's really interesting, the question of nonviolence as sublimation. You could see it that way. I have not, partly because of thinking about disaffection as this pivot that Gandhi uses from this, as an instrument of British repression to a way to label his movement and, as a way to understand nonviolence. And I'm forgetting the name of the author now, but there's a really interesting work on Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence as not passive, but deeply embodied, itself a kind of embrace of violence, right? It's a very, bloody and carceral activity, the work of nonviolence. And so between that understanding of it and the way that it imagines itself as a negation of British governmentality in that moment where Gandhi's appropriating that term, I feel like these are ways to read it, not as sublimation, but it's a really provocative question. Thank you.
Just a word on this, but thank you, John, for the comments. They were really, and the questions, I think they were great. And I love the way you bring the two talks together. I'll just say something about sublimation. I think I hadn't thought of it in those terms, partly because I think the question of psychosis is really central to institutional psychotherapy. It's primarily a theory for psychotic patients, which is why it's interesting. I mean, it's especially interesting. The turn to psychoanalysis is especially interesting because one of the things that Freud was sort of confronted with is that he wasn't sure that his talking cure was going to work with psychotic patients who have a different relationship to the symbolic and a different relationship to transference. So for a while, Freud was thinking, I mean, the most famous case is the Schreber case, where he wasn't sure that there could be transference, and if there is no transference, that there couldn't be psychoanalysis, right? So psychoanalysis would not be sort of appropriate. What's interesting to me about institutional psychotherapy is that, especially someone like Oury, who's perhaps the most, who's written most of the clinical studies of how you can use institutional psychotherapy for psychotic patients. What the suggestion was that in fact psychotics could have transference, but it was just a burst transference. They called it transfert éclaté. So you could, instead of having intersubjective, you could have transference with a group or even like a tree or a telephone. I have no idea what this means practically speaking, but I have talked to some of my psychoanalyst and psychiatrist friends who say that this may be possible. So I don't know if this is a kind of sublimation. Sublimation is certainly the sort of answer that Freud gives to the neurotic, to neurosis. But with psychosis, I'm not sure. I think we're talking about here. it is a form of sublimation, I think, but it's just the idea of having also a life, you know, where your symptoms are less, you're not going to not be a psychotic, right? However much theory you are, if you are a psychotic and you think of this in the structuralist terms in a kind of Lacanian vein, but what you can have is a life where you're more, you know, you're not chained up to a tree, which is literally how they were treated in these hospitals before, and you have a kind of you know, you have a real social community, where you have, you know, these artistic productions, this theater or whatever, and like, you know, a life, and when your symptoms are not completely incapacitating you. So there's not like a kind of full-on solution, but it's better, I think, that certainly that what they had, or even to be completely comatose with a pill, you know, which is also the option that we have today. So they were not anti-medicine, but the question is whether we could use medicine in addition to these social therapies in some ways to try to give them a better life. So the notion of life, and I think the holistic, I mean, I mentioned Georges Canguilhem, but Georges Canguilhem is a very important person for, he was at Saint-Alban during the resistance, but I think this whole idea of a milieu or of life, right, of what is a good life is very important to them. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Did you want to address your questions to each other briefly? Maybe one each.
Yeah, Tanya, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, so I forget now how it followed up from what you were saying about the ending of your book, but I know it did. And it was the question I wanted to ask you about the relationship between institutional psychotherapy and institutional pedagogy that you spoke about. Oh, yeah. Because, you know, many of us are interested in the project of, they call it here like critical university studies, or more broadly, people talk about decolonizing the university. And just the question of the future of education under neoliberalism. So I was really interested in your emphasis on praxis in your account of institutional psychotherapy, and then its relationship to this philosophy of institutional pedagogy. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about how they were related historically, and then how institutional pedagogy might relate to contemporary ideas about reconstituting the university.
Yeah, thanks so much. So historically, institutional psychotherapy was actually related to this movement that was called institutional pedagogy. So there were the person who was very much involved in this was the brother of Jean Oury, so the person who was the Laborde founder, Fernand Oury, who was actually Guattari's teacher. This is the kind of background story, and it's him who gets Guattari involved with Jean Oury and Laborde, and Guattari is studying to be a pharmacist and apparently hating it, so hates it. So he started, and he says you should go to Laborde. And Fernand Oury was a disciple of this guy Célestin Freinet, who had a movement called the Mouvement de l'École Moderne, so the modern school movement, which was basically used some of the same ideas of institutional psychotherapy, so anchored in the praxis of the classroom, thinking about the effects of the unconscious on institutions, and the effects of institutions on the unconscious, the symbolic laws of the classroom, thinking about the desires of the students and the transferential relationships amongst them, and also, so all of these questions, you know, I think that are now pretty more widespread in sort of liberal childhood education, you know, in the kinds of child-led education, but certainly at the university less so. But I think, you know, more abstractly, we can, your question, I think, makes it or encourages us to go back to this question of institutions, and what do you deal, how, you know, I think this is where also institutional psychotherapy is different from anti-psychiatry, and it often gets mixed up. One of what anti-psychiatry wanted to do, so people like R.D. Laing or Cooper or Basaglia, was to get rid of institutions, because institutions were seen as the kind of these totalitarian structures, the vector of human oppression. So you wanted to get rid of them. For institutional psychotherapy, that's just naive, right? Because we still need the institution. Psychosis is precisely like, you need something to ground you, right? Psychosis is free-floating reference. So you need institutions, you need kind of things to bring you down. So the problem is just to figure out how you can use them in a way that can be creative, can be, you know, inspire, emancipatory, So I think, you know, like education, the question, it's not like at some point, it's not like you reach an end point ever with institutional psychotherapy where you say, now I'm disalienated, or now the institution is disalienated, or now the school is disalienated, or the university is disalienated. It's a constant critical project that needs to be, you know, kind of on its, the words that Oury used that I love is ne pas laisser en passer une, which means like to never let one go. Like the minute you think you're disalienated, you start again, right? You start over. So it does pose a real question of temporality, right? Are these like, how long do they last, right? But in the book, I in the conclusion, I put in conversation institutional psychotherapy with the political movements around the common, which I think are also really interested in these kinds of, how can we build, you know, so something like, for example, Occupy or Nuit debout in France, or like, so it was all of this, you know, remember they were always criticized for not having a political program, but that's part of the point. You know, you don't articulate something in advance of the praxis that's going to come out. So you could think, I mean, you know, I haven't thought about it enough to think, but I think there could be really interesting experiments within the university to think about. It's not, the point is not to destroy everything, but it's to use it critically and to rethink through these foundational psychoanalytic notions that I think can help us understand not only individual psyches, but group psychology also. And the unconscious is precisely the kind of the vector through which individuals and collectives can explore fantasies, conflicts, and desires, and the means by which the group can avoid closing closing up on itself.
Yeah, and I don't think that vocabulary is used that much in critical university studies, actually, the idea of the unconscious. What was the unconscious of, you know, the university relations within the university, between students and professors, and so on. Yeah.
Although what's interesting is that I think it's not used so much in that field, but there is a kind of interesting feminist conversation. You know, I mean, I've been reading the Amya Srinivasan book, right, about consent, which is all about, exactly, you know, this trying to, I mean, she's not so psychoanalytic in that way, but she's interested in thinking again beyond a kind of liberal paradigm of rationality, right, into thinking about transference, even though she doesn't use the term, but what she's talking about is transference, right, different relations of power.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So, okay, so I had so many questions for you, but now I feel like I can only ask one. So, okay, so maybe I'll ask you about. I wanted to ask you about the relationship of this book to your first book, because your first book also dealt with questions of public sphere, of cosmopolitanism, but more specifically in the British context. And so I think I would like to know, sort of, if you think that this project, you were trained as a Victorianist, as an expert on British culture, how much of this was a project about the empire, how much of it was it about Britain? And can you talk a little bit about the kind of how you see this project fitting within the existing scholarship on liberalism and empire, which there's a lot of, and you quote it extensively. But at some point you write, for example, I wrote this quote on 183, you read that colonial violence was modernism's, you know, as modernism's possibility. So are you trying in some way, are you interested here? Do you think that the figures in the book that you're analyzing create an alternative public sphere, or is it that they kind of rethink the notion of public sphere to begin with? You know, and so I kind of was curious about these categories that are supposed universalist categories that you show precisely are not universalist, but are you still clinging to a kind of universalism, or are you dismantling the universalism altogether? I think it's just a broader question about, you know, it goes back to this question of institutions. Like, do you, how, you know, is it, how do you decolonize and deterritorialize? Do you turn away, you know, do you turn away, do you not reference the center, or is the center no longer a center? Is it a kind of alternative modernity or a decolonial approach that you're kind of attached, or that you're putting forth in the book? So it's a bit of abstract, but I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, no, thanks. I would say, just to sort of begin at the end of your question, that it is, I find Sukanya Banerjee uses this term trans-imperial, and I find that really useful because, you know, it instead of thinking about metropole and colony, it thinks about circuits and connections across the empire, or even between different empires, because there's been so much interesting work now on inter-imperiality, but this book is is concerned with trans-imperiality. And so it's not so much thinking about alternative modernities so much as interrelated modernities, where there isn't, I don't think that there is that this alternative public sphere, or like this kind of response to the imperial public sphere that we see in the periodicals I'm looking at, it's not separate from it, but it's also not merely derivative. The two spaces, the network of writing that's connecting Britain and India is so tightly in conversation and so mutually constitutive that, and yet, obviously there's different things happening in both spaces, and different politics underpinning it. So there's a, it's just, I think the best way to think of it is alternate modernities. And when I talk about the colonial violence, or the colonial situation underpinned by violence being modernism's condition of possibility, I'm talking like sort of specifically about the modernist, not modernity per se, but the modernist fantasy of East-West exchange and syncretism. This sort of idea that, which is so prevalent both in, for Indian writers and for British writers, that there's, something, mutually replenishing and revitalizing about the encounter of opposites that the East-West conversation is imagined to be. And the various ways that that's romanticized, and the way that romance is, sort of thinly papers over the constitutive violence of that relation. Although the constitutive violence of that relation is also very sort of explicitly taken up by modernist writers, I think. So yeah, I think the most useful thing is to think about interrelated modernities, and very much in conversation about a dialectic, but a dialectic that isn't, just generated by the violence of colonialism, but is just a kind of mutually informing nexus of influence as well. Where in my first chapter on the wild trials and the trials of the Bangabasi newspaper, that's like one of the first sedition trial in India, where a newspaper is tried for sedition, just I think wants to argue that you wouldn't have the wild trials take the shape they did if there wasn't this colonial repression going on in India in the specific form. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank
I
you.
have a lot more, but I don't know if we should open it up for if anybody else has questions.
Sure. I was going to say, are there any questions from the floor, but it's more like, are there any questions from the black squares on the screen? Does anyone want to emerge and raise their hand? I also have questions. But no, silence. I'll just ask a quick one for Tanya, I guess, within the context of this series. One thing that I can already see and this is there already, but it's here within the series itself, is a distinction between disaffection as a lack of feeling, like a total absence of feeling, which is one way some people take it. So the last talk in our series is a new book as well called Disaffected, about unfeeling. And then on the other hand, there's this version of disaffection, which is like too full of emotion, right? It's anger, it's ill will is one of the definitions that's there in the you give this sort of rundown of the different ways that they start to catalogue what disaffection might be within the codification of it in India, and it has all these quite emotion-full words. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about this distinction between disaffection as a loss of emotion or a lack of emotion, as opposed to one that is, and obviously within a colonial context, this sort of politics of emotion around keeping these irrational sort of population from expressing their emotions too fully as part of the project, right? So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And that, I mean, I was so fascinated when I first came across the use of this term in this, in colonial law, and realized how different, that it meant this kind of surplus of emotion, that you have too much emotion that needs to be repressed, right? Or, legislated against. Because I had always associated it with being disengaged, disaffected youth, or people. Literally, it's used to describe youth that skip school. Apparently, yeah. So I mean, I discovered that through research. I hadn't heard of that before, but apparently that's the term for for people that don't attend school. So I was really interested in that discrepancy between the sort of, the absence of affect and the surplus of affect. And I think it is interestingly related to, as you say, this desire to tamp it down, even as you imagine it as being too much, to disappear it or to restrain it, to erase it. So that's interesting. There was another, sorry. My daughter's calling me about her homework. With this time of night. There's another interesting conjuncture where there's the absence and the presence of affect come together in that term, and I'm forgetting what it is. But I know what it is. So I think another reason why it might have taken these sort of two different tracks historically is because it comes, I think it originally, one of the places it comes out of is marriage law, like the disaffected spouse. I think it's used that way in the 18th century. And so there as well, you would have this, the disaffection suggests you no longer have affection, but it might also suggest hostility and certainly a turning away and a negation. So there's both there, right? Both the sort of negative, the sort of positive negative, and the absence of feeling. And so that's perhaps the origin of that tension within the term.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Can I intervene really quickly? With the story about the school children, for instance, and the disaffected children, what would happen if you started to talk to them? In other words, the affects start to display themselves. Maybe they're not opposite at all, but rather one is sort of covering over, perhaps repressing the other.
Or if you even change the institution, it brings us back to the conversation around institutional pedagogy, right? It's a lot of this was for kids who were supposedly disaffected, right? Uninterested in school. So the question is, again, trying to rethink the school structure, rethink the institution to accommodate those emotions, not to try to block them out, or not accommodate, but at least allow, I don't know if you can accommodate emotions, but allow a space for these emotions to exist.
I mean, I guess the most instrumental reading would be that these are students that, this might sound too jaded, but that the institution can't be bothered with anymore, potentially. Like they've just lost causes or something like that.
But this is the same thing that Tanya talked about with the disaffected Trump voters. And I think this was another interesting connection that we talked about our books, that in some ways that the emotion, that one of the problems of the left is that it's sort of, I don't know if you've talked about this in the seminar, but it seems to me that the left has kind of given up on the question of emotions altogether, in the way that it didn't in the 60s in France, for example, at this moment. So now the disaffected Trump voters are either seen as a kind of, as basically a failure of rationality from a liberal perspective, or else as a displacement of a social reality that is more profound, like class, from a kind of vulgar Marxist perspective. But what about a theory that would take seriously their disaffection, their anger, their identificatory but relations to Trump, their transference, like all of those things, so that's, again, I think neither liberalism nor Marxism have provided very good analyses of either disaffected children or disaffected voters, I think.
Yeah, that's the aim of the series, and whatever follows from this. Yeah, I mean, the other one I've noticed is disaffected with mathematics, which is a very common description of
really
of children.
Yeah, maybe that's what your daughter was calling about.
That's right.
Yeah, I think it was actually her French homework.
Okay. All right. On that note, let's finish our seminar. And thanks again to
so much. Thank you, John.
Thank you for inviting us, John. Thank you so much, John, for the response, and thanks, Ben, and thank you, everybody else.
Thanks,
It's a
everyone.
great pleasure. Thanks.
Bye-bye.